Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Book Passage. My name is Melissa Sestaro, and wow, is it fantastic to see such a great community of people out this evening in their independent bookstore to celebrate Janis Cooke Newman's hot off-the-press novel. When you come out to these events, we're really grateful because you're supporting not only the independent spirit, but these fantastic authors that we are so fortunate to be able to host here. And tonight we have two exceptionally talented writers here with us, Janis Cooke Newman and Michael David Lukas. Michael is the author of the award-winning novel, The Oracle of Stamboul. His writing has appeared in many prestigious publications, including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Slate. He has worn the hats of Fulbright Scholar, a night shift proofreader in Tel Aviv, a waiter at Bread Loaf Writers Conference, and he is about to, any day, wear the hat of first-time father. Janis Cooke Newman is the author of the memoir, The Russian Word for Snow, and the highly acclaimed novel, Mary, which is a fantastic story about Mary Todd Lincoln. Janis is also a major player in the Bay Area literary scene here. She actually started many years ago at our Travel Writers Conference, and this year she's going to be on staff, so we hope that you will all check that out. We have lots of information about that great conference in our newsletter. Janis is also the founder of Lit Camp and the Basement Reading Series. She has taught at the Grotto and done fundraising for both Scholar Match and 826 Valencia. And between all that, she has penned an absolutely stunning new book, A Master Plan for Rescue. And I'm going to use Elaine Petrocelli's words here. She did choose it as one of her picks for this month. And she has deemed it a glorious tale and an important novel that will be read and savored for years. We are so happy, Janis, to finally have your beautiful book on our shelves. Please join me in welcoming Michael and Janis to Book Passage.
I was just thinking we have a lot of names between us.
I know, 6. So I thought, or you thought, and told me to say, that maybe, but I think it's a great idea, that maybe we could start out by you reading a short passage from the book.
I would be so happy to. I'm going to start by, I'm just going to read the very beginning of the book because that always seems like the best place to start. And then I don't have to do a lot of explanation about the book. Because I will assume that pretty much no one here has read the book since it just came out today. So it's a very short opening because I think it's incredibly boring to listen to a writer read their whole book to you. But I will put these glasses on first so I can read it. And then juggle this mic. This is the moment I spend the rest of my life trying to return to. The three of us sitting around the table, my father and I, have painted red to match the Flash's cape. A shade I now know that doesn't belong in a kitchen. But it was my father who suggested bringing the comic book to the paint store on Dykeman Street. It's early December, and the clanging of the radiator mixes with the violins that spill from the speakers of the Silvertone radio. I know the Silvertone is on because it is always on. My grandfather, a man once known as the gentleman bootlegger, a man who is dead by this time, claimed that music during meals is what separates man from beast. And so my mother, his daughter, puts on music. But we never listen to it. Instead, we sit above bowls that smell of gravy and spices and talk over each other. sometimes banging our silverware on the red table for attention. The three of us, my father, mother, and me, in our small apartment at the northern tip of Manhattan. In this moment, though, there is only the clanging of the radiator and the violins. We have stopped talking, so my father and I can watch my mother add up numbers inside her head. Because that is what she can do, her ability. Though to be more accurate, it's my father who is watching her. I am watching him. And I'm realizing for the first time, and, wait for it, probably because I am so close to turning 12, that it isn't the feat of her adding up those numbers he enjoys so much. It's the way she's sliding the tip of a number 2 pencil into and out of the gap between her front teeth. And now that I've noticed this, I cannot remember a single time my father has taken that pencil back and checked her answer. I can only remember him doing exactly what he's doing now, gazing at her mouth, her eyes, the exact shade of green the Hudson River gets on a clear day, her long swoops of black hair. In the pocket of the black mass pants I have not yet had time to change out of is something rare I am waiting to show my father. This morning, during Father Barry's sermon, I found the stub of a mass candle caught under my kneeler, and I've spent the past hour melting its wax into the hollow of a perfectly round beer bottle cap, creating an object I believe will make me unbeatable at the game of Scully. I'm at best a mediocre Scully player. However, with this new Scully cap, this holy Scully cap, it will be as if God himself is directing my thumb every time I flick my cap across the chopped squares of the board, as if his mighty force is propelling my cap into that of another player, one filled merely with the wax of a melted crayon. As I wait, I imagine myself dropping the holy Scully cap into my father's hand, telling him the story of finding the candle, melting the wax. I know that when I finish this story, my father will lift his eyes, brown like mine, and run them over me, reading me. I know too that he will understand all the powers I believe the holy Scully cap to possess without me having to say them aloud, because that is what he can do, his ability. I do not yet have an ability. I am only an almost 12-year-old boy, small for my age, black-haired like my mother, wanting no more than for the life I have to keep going as it is. All these things are held in that moment. Everything I am about to lose. My mother adding up numbers inside her head. My father watching as she slides the tip of a number 2 pencil into and out of the gap between her teeth. Me, with something rare I am waiting to show my father. It has been a cold day, the temperature barely making it into the 20s. But the chill has thinned the air and the sky is clear. The last rays of sunlight slant through the front windows of our apartment. And though it is only mid-afternoon, there's a sense of the day ending, that nostalgic Sunday afternoon feeling of wishing to remain exactly where you are. Those things too are held in that moment, the moment before the violins turn into words, turn into surprise attack and Japanese bombs and Pearl Harbor. It is my father's hand I'm looking at when my eyes go bad. My father's hands are not like anyone else's. The skin in the creases has been bleached white by the chemicals he uses to develop his photographs. My father shoots portraits, and I think of those white marks as the ghosts of every picture he has ever taken. It's these white marks that disappear first, blurring into nothingness, like ghosts vanishing. Then the hand itself, the edges melting away, dissolving into a table painted a red that doesn't belong in a kitchen. My eyes dart around the room, but everything has turned into a mass of color, as if the outline of each object, the icebox, the stove, the window over the sink, has been erased. As if the boundaries that keep the color of one thing from invading another no longer exist. And what I can only think, is that it is the Japanese. That they, with their bombs, have knocked the entire world out of focus. I search for my father, stare into the space where a second ago he was sitting, but there's nothing there except the brownish red smudge of the wallpaper, and it feels like those bombs have sucked all the air out of the room, along with the outlines of things, because I cannot breathe, can only gasp. I hurl my arm into the place where my father had been, stunned that the Japanese could have taken it from me, amazed at their evil magic. My hand collides with something, the bones of his chest, the worn fabric of his shirt. My father shifts in his chair, drops his hand over mine, and I realize that his reddish hair, the Sunday stubble on his face, his brown shirt, have all merged with the wallpaper behind him, turning him invisible. I press the flat of my hand against his chest until I can feel his heart beating. And that's better, but only a little, because now Aunt May, my mother's sister, and Uncle Glenn are in our kitchen, which I know only by the sound of their voices. The two of them up from their apartment 1 floor below. And I have the sense from the confident movement of their blurs, Uncle Glenn's pudgy and beer-colored, Aunt May's still in the navy blue suit she wore to Mass, that they do not see our kitchen as an unnavigable smudge of color. And I'm figuring out by the way Aunt May is clattering what sounds like rosary beads on the table and saying we should all go straight back to Good Shepherd and repeat 1,000 Hail Marys for peace, saying to my father, yes, even you, Dennis, my father having long declared that Ireland more than cured him of Catholicism. And by the way, Uncle Glenn keeps repeating that first thing tomorrow morning, he's going to Whitehall Street and joining up. And by how the black-haired blur of my mother is heading for the living room, shouting back that everybody needs to pipe down because she can't hear the radio, that it is only me who is seeing the world this way. And that is worse, much worse. I take my hand off my father's chest and press both palms into my eyes until I see sparks of light. And then I press harder, as if that light is a mechanism for fixing what has gone wrong. But when I open my eyes, nothing has changed. Or, I suppose, everything has. I have to say something, I'm thinking, tell somebody, but I can't pull enough air into my lungs for speech. And even if I could, everybody is talking about the Japanese and their bombs. Except my father, who hasn't moved, hasn't spoken, who I believe has been running his eyes over me, reading me. Jack, he says, how many fingers? But I cannot tell he has raised his hand. And that's the first chapter.
So when I was reading this book, it called to mind a number of other books. I'm particularly thinking Nicole Krauss's A History of Love, a little bit of Michael Chabon's Kavalier and Clay, and then also the selected works of T.S. Spivak. And yet, at the same time, it's totally unique. It's totally, unlike anything I've ever read. And I'm curious, because of that sort of mixture between the familiarity and the singularity, it made me wonder about what was the germ of the book, where did it come from, and how did this amazingly sort of familiar and yet unique book come into being?
It's an interesting list you have, because of all the books you mentioned, the only one I've ever read is The Amazing Adventures of Kavalier and Clay.
How interesting.
Yeah.
Wow.
Which is a huge favorite of mine. It came from a number of sources. One of the original germs is when I was at the Holocaust Museum, and I found the story of the St. Louis. which if any of you, it's not very well known, I had not known it. The St. Louis was a pleasure boat, and in 1939, 900 Jewish refugees got on it and sailed from Hamburg, and they all had visas for Cuba. And they were not allowed to land in Cuba. And then they tried to land in Florida, in the US, and they were not allowed to land there, and they were sent back. And I found this an amazing story, and one of the great pleasures of writing historical fiction is that you can put a character in a place or on a boat, and then you get to live it. And it's one of the pleasures of reading historical fiction as well. And so I wanted to write about that. I was fascinated by anti-Semitism in America during the war. So that was one germ. Another was that I'm the mother of a son. And at the time I started this book, my son was 12, and that's how long it took to write, because he's 20 now. And I was fascinated by this boy's world. Boys at 12 are as firmly in childhood as they are in adulthood. You may discover this at some point soon, or in 12 years.
I know it well, yeah.
Yes. And I was so fascinated about how boys can do that, because girls are not quite the same. And I thought, I'd like to write from a boy's point of view and see, because they just have such a fascinating worldview.
So that like segues into two different questions, but I'm just going to choose one of them, the historical fiction. I also write historical fiction, and I was amazed by how you were able to inhabit this particular time and place. And I learned from your father, who I was talking to before the reading or the event, that he grew up on Dyckman Street in northern Manhattan, where Jack grew up. And so I'm wondering, in addition to that, how you came to sort of inhabit the time and place that you're writing about.
Yes, so I stole liberally from my dad, who's here, who was flown out from South Carolina to be here, and to whom the book is dedicated. And unfortunately is still awake, because he got up at 1:30 in the morning our time to be here. But yes, he grew up, and he was a little younger than Jack at this time in New York, and he told me a lot of these stories, and we went to the apartment, and we stood on the roof where so much of this book took place. And he would tell me these great stories about what it was like to grow up during the war in Manhattan. And there were these great things where during air raids, they would give the kids these ribbons to wear, which I've now discovered today that I got the color wrong. But you would wear these ribbons, and if you lived near to the school, they thought it was perfectly okay if the Germans were bombing Manhattan, that you could run home and you would be safe. I guess you would just run between the bombs. But he would tell me these wonderful stories about, and we would drive around Manhattan together, and he would tell me what it was like during the war. And there are a lot of World War II books out. And I think maybe 5 or 6 years ago, there must have been something in the zeitgeist that affected so many of us authors, because we did all write about that time. But it's so much more interesting to have someone tell you the stories. Then I think I'm a good person to write historical fiction, because I really don't like research. I just like writing. So I enjoy getting the history from another person telling me than reading a book.
So in addition to sort of like being impressed by your ability to conjure this wartime Manhattan, which is a part of your family history, I was also really impressed by your ability to sort of like inhabit almost, I would say, a Jewish style. And so much so, you told me before I read the book that you're not Jewish. But if you had not told me that, I don't think I would have believed it if you had told me after I read the book. Because there's something, and I think that, that's why I mentioned Nicole Krauss, The History of Love, because there's something very sort of, I don't know if there is like a Jewish style of prose writing, but there's something about that book and about your book that really creates this sense of just sort of like all-encompassing Jewishness that I recognize from my own upbringing. And so I was very impressed by that, and I want to know how you did it.
Well, I'm flattered that you say that. And it reminds me when we were trying to come up with a title for this book, which was an incredibly painful and difficult process. My friend, Jeff Greenwald, who was going through it, he looked at me and he went, I think you should call this the best book about Jews ever written by a shiksa. Which I was totally on board with. I thought, what a great title. I don't know. I'm going to say, married for almost 20 years to someone Jewish, so maybe that affected me.
Sure.
And I did live in New York for a very long time, so that could also have been. But I think it's a thing about writing and writing fiction. You do have to inhabit your characters, and you have to understand them. And so, of course, Jack is an Irish kid, and I am half Irish, so I inhabited him. Jacob, of course, is a Jewish character. And to learn that character, I read the Christopher Isherwood stories. And that's how I do my research. I don't really use a lot of texts and factual books and nonfiction. I read very little nonfiction. I read a lot of fiction. And so when I'm trying to get into a character, I will go and find a novel. I read Suite Française also. So when I was writing Rivka, I read that book. And so I think that that's what informs when I'm writing, and I try to write from an emotional place rather than a factual place. And so maybe that's how I got it. That's how I would understand where the character was coming from, rather than, just trying to decide it elsewhere.
So back to this idea of sort of being fascinated with your 12-year-old son and wanting to kind of inhabit that man-boy moment. The character, Jack, is so lovely and so sort of unsure, in that way that adolescent boys are. He's so sure of himself and he's so unsure. And he has this sort of magical thinking. But then he also has this kind of rationalist side. And if you could just talk about sort of the creation of that character and writing from his perspective.
So every character that you have should have a flaw. It's something I always tell my students. Your character should have flaws. They're only interesting if they're flawed. And they need to want things. Characters are also only interesting if they want things. I think it's why everyone loves, or so many people love, Scarlett O'Hara. She's a truly flawed person, not very nice, but she really wants things. Jack is a character. He's flawed. I mean, he has to want something, and he has to learn something in the book. But there was a lot I identified with him. I feel like I'm a person who also engages in a fair amount of magical thinking myself. And so I could write from that point of view. I'm not sure as a writer you can write a character you don't understand on some level. And so I could understand that. And I thought, the worst thing in the world will happen to him in this book. How can he cope with it? How can he figure out how to cope with the worst thing in the world happening to him and get through it? And I put myself in that place, and I thought, oh, well, what would I do, if I were him? And that's what I wrote from.
And there's something so amazing about his magical thinking, because I don't want to give any spoilers, but he sort of wants something so much that he believes it's true in spite of the evidence otherwise. And he believes it so strongly that you as the reader start to believe it too. And then you start to believe in the possibility of magic in the world too. And there's all these little elements that make you feel like, okay, maybe this thing that he wants, maybe there is magic in the world that would allow this to happen. Like he's got this little codograph that he's like getting messages through, kind of, or he's decoding messages with. And then there are these pigeons on the roofs, and they're carrying messages back and forth. And so you begin to believe with this architecture that you've set up that like magic can happen. Yeah, I just like that so much. It's not a question.
Well, and also because Jack is obsessed with the radio world. And it's a time, which is another thing my dad told me about, which is that people for entertainment listen to the radio. And it requires your imagination. I downloaded a lot of radio shows when I was working on this book and listened to Jack Armstrong, the All-American Boy, and the Green Hornet in the Shadow, and they're pretty fun. But you have to use your imagination because you are not looking at anything, you're just listening. And so you begin to see these things in your head, which is different. It's more like reading, where you imagine these things in your head. And so there's a certain magic to that. And you create a world in your head, which is not too dissimilar from what Jack does. And then you want something and you can create it in your head. And it's not so different from what fiction writers do. You know, we spend a lot of time in an imaginary world with imaginary people, creating stories about them, which is also what Jack does. And so it was all kind of a piece, and it's all really about the power of stories, because denial is also a story we tell ourselves. And sometimes the stories save us, and sometimes they hurt us.
True. So, besides Kavalier and Clay and Sweet Frances and Isherwood, what were some of the books that you read that kind of informed this book?
For a long time when I first started, I read a lot of YA because I was trying to find Jack's voice, and I was unsure what point of view, where I was. It took me 7 years to write this book, and a lot of it was I couldn't decide, was I going to write Jack from his child view or was I going to write him from his adult view? It was enormously liberating when I realized I would write him from his adult view, looking back, and then I had that sense. And I think because you have in your book as well, you have a child at the heart of your book, and I think that's an interesting and good question when you have that, and you have a child I have several first-person narrators in my book. For most of it, it's Jack. And you have to decide, and it's tricky if you have a 12-year-old at the heart. And then once I decided that was not always going to be. Did you face that with yours?
Definitely. It's very hard to write that, especially an adolescent or pre-adolescent character who doesn't have the adult perspective sort of peeking in every once in a while. It's hard to stay there because you inherently have an adult perspective because you're an adult, and your readers are probably mostly adults. So there's the adults that are hanging out regardless of whether the character is sort of like going there or not. So it's very restraining, I found, to do that. Yeah. But you do it so well. And so were there any books that you read that were like where you were like, oh, I'm trying to, besides the YA books, where you were trying to find that voice that really resonated with you?
I read Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close, and that was useful to me because it had such a strong voice. But for me, that book was useful to write about grief. It's very hard to think about writing grief from a boy's point of view because they're not very articulate about it. And so that book to me was a useful tool.
Speaking of writing and how difficult it is, you teach writing. And having been through this process and your other books, what sort of nuggets of advice would you give to the writers out there?
Okay. So some of my students are here, they're going to know things I say.
Don't repeat any nuggets.
What I always tell my students is that you as the writer are the least important person in the room. One of the most important people in the room is the reader. I always am thinking about what do I want the reader to be thinking and feeling in this moment. I always think about that because you have to be thinking, okay, now I've got my character is moving through this, I am thinking my character is obviously important. What does my character want in this moment? What is my character feeling? But also, what do I want my reader to be thinking and feeling? Because when we read a book, we want to be moved. We want to be moved emotionally on some level, and you don't really want your reader to be sitting there thinking, boy, that Janis Cooke Newman is a good writer, because that's exhausting. If that's what you're thinking the whole time you're reading, that's not actually an enjoyable reading experience. What you really want to be your reader to be thinking, oh my God, what's going to happen to that character next? Or I can't wait to find out. Are they going to really do this? Is this going to happen next? Maybe when they're done with the book, you want them to think, wow, I guess that was a great book. I guess that was a good writer. But you really want them to be so engaged with the story. So that's your ultimate goal when you're writing. And sometimes so many people, I think especially out of MFA programs, they think that their goal is to write absolutely gorgeous sentences. It's not really about that. It's to write a really riveting story with characters people absolutely care about. And that's your goal, I think, as a writer. And because there's an awful lot of things out there that are competing for your reader's attention, because they could be watching True Detective and not reading your book. So that's what you're competing against.
Yikes.
Michael's now going home to write. But I read your book, again, and before this, and I was like, yeah, I could be watching True Detective, but I'm going to go read The Oracle of Istanbul now.
Well, all of you should go out. And instead of True Detective, I heard the second season isn't even very good.
No, I would say actually it's pretty damn good.
It is, really?
Yes.
But A Master Plan for Rescue. Very good conversation. But I have one last question, which is a question I've always wanted someone to ask me, which is, what is a question that you wish someone would ask you and then answer it?
Oh, man. I don't know if I have one. Maybe what was the easiest part to write of the book?
Okay. What was the easiest part of the book to write?
Okay, I will tell you this. The whole Jacob section just came out almost exactly as it exists in the book. It was one of those, when people say, oh, that whole section wrote itself, which I always think is like such nonsense when people say that. That section almost did write itself. I don't know why. It just flowed.
Yeah.
It was one of those weird things.
I really love that section too.
Thank you.
And even though we didn't talk about it, but it just sort of like, it was just this beautiful love story set in wartime Berlin. And yeah.
And what's the one question you always wish someone would ask you?
I don't know. I'm the asker of questions here. Well, this is, I think, a good segue to turn it over to the audience if they have any questions for you. What's the one question you wish you could ask Janis Cooke Newman?
I have a question that both of you could answer. I know that a lot of the process of writing is, in fact, editing and rewriting. What is the most painful or difficult cut that each of you had to make to your book? When you had to kill your darling, what was your most darling?
Well, mine is easy. So I had 80 pages of backstory for Jack's father in Ireland, and I had to cut all of it. My editor, I tried very hard. I made it shorter, I moved it around, and then finally I thought, if I was turning this book into a movie, I would cut this. She's probably right. The beauty of it is that I have taken it and put another character in it and turned it into a new novel that I'm working on. So, yeah, so I guess that was okay, but it was extremely painful because I loved that section.
Oh, man. I just cut, this is like really making my heart beat fast. I just cut like 80 pages from the novel that I'm writing on now. It's just so hard to do that because you're like, God, how long did that take me to write? And in particular, there was this one scene that I just really loved about like the main character and his like dog. And every time I read it, and it was like his mom, and it would like make me cry every time I read it. Like I didn't grow up with a dog. I just got a dog, but I didn't have one until I cut this thing. But like, I don't know, maybe now my dog is like filling the place of that section. But it's just really hard to cut things that are done. Because you're like, this is done, this is good, this is working, as a scene. And then you have to sort of step back and be like, well, it's not really working for the novel. It's not serving the greater good. But it's hard. It's really hard. It's like killing your pets or something.
And you can remember like just where you were sitting when you wrote it.
Yeah. And you're just like, this is so good. I even like read it at a reading, and people were like crying. You know, like you're like, how can I cut this? But yeah, you gotta cut it.
Anyone else? Yeah, Ricky.
Well, since you have magical thinking as part of this book, I had an experience 10 or 15 years ago being a speaker at a conference, and Lolita Tatamy, whose book Cane River had just come out, and of course hadn't read it yet. It's embarrassing, but anyway, most of the people in the audience had, and she was on Oprah's list. Anyway, but we were sitting in the green room before we went on stage, and she told me how she wrote the book, which was she took a break from, I guess, being like CFO at Oracle, and channeled basically her relatives in the bayous in Louisiana, and really was in this meditative space. And she said that the book just flowed out of her, but only after she rarefied her existence and basically was a hermit and holed up. So as I was listening to you, I thought, did you have that level of sort of meditative removal from the day-to-day world when you would like really get into the Jacob voice and it just wrote itself, or was it like so much writing where you're crafting something and you're judging it and you're kind of still in your active intellectual mind?
I did not have the luxury of getting away, but you know, I wrote most of this book at the Writer's Grotto, so I had an office there. And so, you know, for that, you can, in my mind, you can only write, I don't know about you, but I can only do like 2-3 hours a day.
Yeah.
Unless I'm revising, you could do more, but new writing 2-3 hours a day. So I'd go there. I did write a lot of the Jacob stuff at Christmas when most of the Grotto people were away. Because writing in community is nice, but sometimes it's almost too much community. And so I had to put a sign on my door that said, do not knock on this door unless the building is on fire. Because people after a while would knock on the door. So I did have some quiet time there. That does help. A lot of people are good about going away on retreat, writer's retreat, but it's hard unless you were CFO of some big company to get that time away. Yeah. Monique?
Well, I'm struck by the fact that it took you 7 years to write it. I mean, I know that, but so you're writing this book and you start in 7 years ago when your son is 12 and now he's 20, and life goes on in that time period. And in that time period, everything happens to you and you presumably grow one way or another as a person. Did you find that in crafting this story and then honing it toward the end, I mean, that passage of time, did it make a difference in how you perceived your characters, how they moved forward in the world through your imagination?
I can only assume that it did. I don't know if everyone heard that. There's 7 years how I changed. I'm sure that changed how I saw my characters and how the book changed over that time. You can't help but have that happen because your novel is a large part of you, and it comes out that way.
And I think, you know, you're changing, the book is changing, and you're becoming a different writer. I found that I'll look over passages I wrote, you know, 3 or 4 years ago and be like, I don't know about this, or like, you know, this is good, but it's not me. So that's, you know, your personality is changing, but also yourself as a writer is changing, I think.
Yeah. In the back.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying about the radio. I work in radio, and I've always seen it as the theatre of the mind. And I guess my question is about what I call unreliable memories, and maybe as much for your father as it is for you. I grew up being told, you know, that I was born in Liverpool in 1942 during an air raid, and my mother said that's why you're highly strung. And so I went through life smiling about this, and I announced it on air one day when we were doing a call-in program, and somebody quickly told me that there was no air raid in Liverpool in August 1942. So now I'm feeling better about it. I then checked up. I was conceived 9 months earlier, so I was conceived during an air raid. So I felt good. I asked the question because with historical fiction, if it sounds true, that itself is good enough. And I think when you're talking about the implied reader and how does the reader feel, the reader's got to feel in the authenticity of what's happening at that moment. And so I'm pleased this is historical fiction, just in case the memories aren't reliable.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I have nothing to add.
A comment and then a question. I would be 3 years younger than Jack, and I grew up in the Bronx, but Dykeness Street led right down onto Fordham Road in the Bronx. When you were talking about the Skelly and the special characteristics of the different caps, it brought back memories, as did a lot of the description of December 7th. Great job.
Thank you.
But when you were talking about how you have to put yourself into thinking about the characters and so on, does that mean that a fiction writer cannot really do a good job of nonfiction and vice versa?
Well, I'm not sure that you can say that. I mean, I started as a memoirist, so that would be nonfiction, and I write travel. So hopefully I do them both okay. So I don't think you can make statements like you can't cross between the two, because I do know a lot of writers who do.
Thank you.
Yeah. Mac?
I have read the book, and I loved it. But to me, a lot of it was a book about disability, and that's a personal bias of mine. But I experienced, there was physical disability, people who were disabled by grief, people who were disabled by historical events. Jack becoming disabled and having to find another, having to find another tribe in school. And I just wondered if you thought consciously about the theme of disability when you were writing.
It is a thread that I thought about. I think because it's echoed in wartime. In wartime, you have to be perfect. You can't be 4F. You have to be perfect to go and fight. And it was a theme with the Nazis. They were very big on people had to be perfect. They had a eugenics program. You had to be perfect. And they would, they also had an abortion program, for people who were not perfect. And so I liked that theme also playing out in the world, that there was no place for people who were not perfect, because I think that that was also something that happened and was worth exploring in this book, because it happens with Jack and with other people and with his uncle, who's 4F. So I think that was, in a novel, what's so great about novel writing is that it's big enough for you to have multiple themes. And so I liked putting that in this book.
Well, as I've said, you do it with great tenderness.
Thank you. Thanks. Oh, that was my intention, and not to take a Nazi point of view of it. And, so yes, and so I wanted to make that also part of it. Mike?
Kind of a technical question, but since the character, I hadn't read the book, but my husband is a librarian for the blind, so I'm wondering, is this available in accessible formats and audiobooks?
Yes, there is an amazing audio version of this where they used 5 different actors for the different point of view characters. They did a really amazing job, and they sent me the different actors' voices, and I actually was able to veto 2 of them because the actors sounded too old. Because the men that they were playing were in their 20s, and so they changed them. And because also Jack talks about his acute hearing and then describes the voices, so they were not correct. And so they actually took the time to change them. So I feel really blessed that I got like good voices. So there is an audio version. I saw it on Amazon. It's super expensive. It was like $35 or something. I was like, whoa. But it does exist, and I think that my hunch is it's very good production. Yeah. Anyone else? Before? Pam?
I'm wondering if you can talk a little about historical fiction in general, because my sense is that this is the moment for historical fiction. If you think about it, it used to be considered kind of lower genre fiction and even bodice-ripper type of not very good storytelling. And now, if you look at the bestseller fiction list, there's so many good historically centered novels out now, award-winning novels. We could name probably 10 off the top of our heads now. So I wondered if you have a sense of how something has changed in the publishing world or in the minds of authors.
Well, I think Michael and I are real happy to hear that.
Yeah, definitely.
Maybe we have Anthony Dewar to thank, I don't know. But I think you're right. I've always been a fan of good historical fiction, but I will say, like when Mary came out, which was 9 years ago, yeah, I think there were people who thought, oh, is this like a bodice ripper thing? And obviously it's not. And now it's, yes, historical fiction the reputation is definitely better. Because people like it. I mean, in my mind, why would I write about now? First of all, you can't write about now because when your book comes out, then it's not now. It's dated. And I already know about now. So it's not fun to write about now. I already know what it's like to write about now. To write about another time is like this very cool form of time travel. And I can experience it to write about another time. So that's more fun to me. And in many ways, often more fun to read.
So maybe that's what's happened. 'Cause I agree with that, and so but I see for my own case, there's more and more really high quality books of that kind to read now, and Anthony.
Yeah, Anthony Dewar definitely did us a service.
Anthony Mara is another one.
Yeah, Tony Mara
And
definitely
there's,
did.
you know, there's quite a few. So I guess maybe our case is becoming more of a mass case in that literary way.
Yeah, I think that's probably, very true. I mean, it's crazy to just say one genre is not literary enough. I mean, why? Why would you do that? Anyone else before we? All right.
Well, thank you so much, Janice. And
Thank you, Michael.
I